It's the sound. The constant, low-frequency hum of generators running like the base itself is breathing through a broken nose. Then dust, fine as talcum powder, the color of old teeth that gets into everything. Your food, your rifle, and the back of your throat at 3 in the morning when you're lying on your cot wondering what the hell you're doing here. I've been stationed at Kestrel for 11 days when Sergeant First Class Marquez Delane made his first joke about her. To be fair, we're standing outside the maintenance bay, a collection of about 7 of us from 3rd Platoon, watching Staff Sergeant Yara Osei strip down a M240B that had been jamming on Lieutenant Carver during the last patrol. The gun was spread across a green tarp like a body on an operating table. Pieces organized in a row, each one deliberate. Each one placed exactly where she could find it in the dark if she had to. And she could. That, was the thing nobody wanted to say out loud. Delane had a habit of spitting sunflower seeds when he was bored. He spit pretty much one now, watched it land 2 inches from her knee, and said, "Must be nice having all day to play with your toys, Osei." She didn't look up. PFC Torres, who was 19, and thought Delane was the funniest man alive because Delane had told him so repeatedly, laughed like it was the best line he'd heard all week. I didn't laugh, but I didn't say anything either, and that's the part one still think about. My name is Specialist Calvin Reyes. I grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas, which means I knew heat before the Army introduced me to it, and I knew what it felt like to be the kid that people weren't sure about yet. Honestly, not disliked. Just unproven, a maybe. I've been in country for 4 months. Yara had been here for 7. I knew her by reputation before I knew her by name. When I first arrived at Kestrel, the outgoing specialist who briefed me on the base, a tall guy from Ohio named Brennan who smelled like diesel and chewing tobacco, had mentioned her almost as an aside. The communications girl, he'd said, Osei, which she can hear a radio malfunction before the equipment knows it's malfunctioning. Sounds like bull, but I've seen it. Brennan said it the way people say things they can't explain and don't want to try. I filed it away. What I actually saw when I finally met her was a woman who was about 5'6", with forearms that looked like she'd been carrying something heavy her entire life, and a quality of stillness that I associated with people who'd gotten very good at waiting. She wasn't unfriendly. She wasn't warm. She was somewhere in a middle register that most soldiers never find, professional without being cold, present without being available. She fixed things, which that was her function at Kestrel, in the simplest terms. Equipment. Radios. The ancient sinkers set in the comm tent that had been giving static during night ops for 2 weeks before she arrived, and never gave static again after she touched it. Weapons systems. Once, memorably, the base commander's laptop, which she returned to Captain Hendricks with 12 years of recovered files, and a look that said she wouldn't be explaining her methods. She was also, and this is the part that chafed certain people, the best shot at the base. Not the best shot among the women. The best shot. Period. And on the range, she shot like she was having a conversation. Calm, unhurried. Each round going somewhere was expected to go. The groupings she left on paper targets looked like mistakes. Too tight. Too centered, which like she'd been cheating somehow. Except there was no way to cheat that nobody could figure out. Delane had a theory, which he shared regularly, that the targets were rigged, that for what it's worth, there was some arrangement, some accommodation. He said it the way people say things they know are wrong, but keep saying anyway because saying it fills a space they can't otherwise fill. 7 of us heard him say variations of this over 11 days, and 6 of us said nothing, and that's the math I kept running in my head during the weeks that followed. The morning of the 17th, the temperature hit 114 by 0900. I know this because Corporal Nesbitt had a small thermometer zip tied to his pack, a thing his grandmother had sent him, and he checked it with the diligence of a man checking the pulse of something he was worried about. 114. He announced to no one in particular, sitting outside the motor pool. 1:15 by noon, Yara said, walking past with a Mbitcha radio unit tucked under one arm and a soldering iron in her other hand, not breaking stride. She was right. It hit 115 at 11:47, which Nesbitt looked at his thermometer, looked in the direction she'd gone, and said, "How does she do that?" "Which," said Torres, who thought he was joking. "I thought about Brennan. About she can hear a radio malfunction before the equipment knows it's malfunctioning. There were people who paid attention to the world, and people who didn't. Then there was Yara, who seemed to be operating on some additional frequency that the rest of us simply weren't tuned to. That afternoon, Delane found a new angle. We were in the briefing room, a generous name for a plywood box with a pull-down map and 3 folding tables, getting walked through the next week's patrol rotations by Lieutenant Carver. Yara was present because the patrols in question ran through a sector with notoriously poor communications terrain, and Carver wanted her assessment of relay positioning. She gave it in about 90 seconds. Honestly, plus concise. For what it's worth, technical. Plus, she pointed to 3 positions on the map with a pen, explained the elevation issue at Point Bravo, recommended a frequency shift for the 3rd patrol window, and sat back down. Carver nodded. "Good. We'll coordinate with respect, sir," Delane said. And whenever someone says with respect in that tone of voice, you know the respect is largely theoretical. We've run this sector before without relay adjustments. I'm not sure we need to restructure based on a pause, just long enough to be noticed, a communications assessment. Carver looked at him. "Sergeant Delane." "Sir, we ran that sector before without relay adjustments, and Kowalski's patrol came back with 2 hours of dead comms over a live contact zone. Does that sound like a thing we want to repeat?" Silence. "No, sir." "Good. We'll use TBH, Sergeant Osei's positioning recommendations." Delane nodded. But when Carver turned back to the map, Delane's eyes moved sideways to Torres, and his mouth did something small and dismissive, and Torres looked at the table, and I looked at my hands, and Yara looked at the wall with the expression of someone who had been here before. Not here at FOB Kestrel. Here in pretty much this particular room with this particular math, running since long before any of us arrived. 3 days before General Hargrove's visit, Yara's Sinkers unit caught something. She was alone in the comm tent at 0215. I knew because I was on perimeter check and I saw the light, and whatever she heard in that static made her walk straight to Captain Hendrix's quarters and knock until he answered. I found out what happened from Nesbit the next morning. She'd picked up a fragment of an encrypted transmission on a frequency that wasn't supposed to be active in our sector. Pretty much partial, degraded. Most people would have called it background noise and gone back to sleep. Yara had sat with it for 40 minutes, running it through the unit's logging system, isolating the signal pattern, before she was certain enough to wake the CO. What she'd found, pieced together from static and mathematics, was the edge of a coordination signal. Insurgent activity, 2 clicks north, organized enough to use encryption. By 0600, Command had confirmed it. A cache, a weapons cache, hidden in the remains of an agricultural building that showed as empty on our maps, had been active for at least 3 weeks. They pulled it at 0900. 11 personnel. I mean, nobody hurt. Nesbit told me all this while eating a cold MRE, matter of fact, like he was reporting the weather. "So, she basically stopped an operation," I said. "She heard static," Nesbit said. "And she knew it wasn't just static." I thought about that. I thought about Delane's face in the briefing room. I thought, to be fair, about Torres laughing at a sunflower seed landing near her knee. I thought about silence and what it costs and who pays. That evening, I was cleaning my rifle in the maintenance bay when Yara came in to return the soldering iron to its bracket on the wall. She moved like someone who knew exactly how much space they took up, and I remember thinking that was unusual, that most people either took up too much or apologized for existing, but she just moved through the room at her actual size. I said, "Hey, I heard about last night." She set the soldering iron in its place. "Good work," I said, which I knew was inadequate. She looked at me for a moment, not unfriendly, not warm, that middle register, and said, "You hear enough, you start to know what doesn't sound right." Then she left. I sat there with my disassembled rifle, and the hum of the generator, and the distant, ever-present sound of the desert doing nothing in particular, and I thought about all the things you can hear when you're paying attention, and all the things you miss when you're busy making jokes about someone else's pins rolling on a tarp. The cache, I think, Yara found had contained enough material to reshape what the next 3 weeks looked like at FOB Kestrel, and Delane was on his 4th sunflower seed of the morning before anyone told him. This information reached us the way most significant information reached FOB Kestrel, fragmentarily, through channels, with enough lead time to be anxious but not enough to be prepared. Captain Hendricks gathered the senior NCOs on Saturday morning. By Saturday afternoon, the information had been aerosolized through the base population and was in everyone's lungs whether they wanted it or not. 4-star and 4-star General Richard Hargrove, theater commander, and the man whose name appeared on the orders that govern the orders that govern our lives. Delane seemed energized by this. He spent Saturday and Sunday in a mode I'd come to recognize: performative competence, the kind of busyness that's mostly about being seen being busy. He reorganized his squad's gear with the intensity of a man who believed a general would inspect it personally and grade it. He ran 2 voluntary PT sessions that nobody was required to attend, but everyone understood they were required to attend. He gave a series of small speeches about standards and presence and representing the unit. Hargrove doesn't, in my opinion, care about your locker, Yara said once, quietly, to no one in particular. She was running diagnostic checks on the comm equipment for the 3rd time since the cache operation. Delane heard her. Nobody asked you, Osei. She went back to her diagnostics. TBH, the generator hummed. Monday night was when the complication arrived. The patrol that Captain Hendricks had designated as the general's orientation route, a 12-click loop through the sector's northern approach that would show both our operational familiarity and the terrain, had a problem. The problem had a name: Staff Sergeant Dennis Prue, who was supposed to run communications. Support for the patrol had gone down with a fever that pushed 103 by Monday evening. Hendricks, I guess, stood in the doorway of the medical bay, looked at Prue sweating through his cot, said something under his breath that I was glad I couldn't hear. The patrol was tomorrow at 0700, which the general's helicopter landed at 0600. Hendricks looked at Delane. Delane looked at the wall. Neither of them said the name, but it was already in the room with them. I, in my opinion, was doing perimeter check again. I passed the comm tent at 2100 and the light was on. I knocked. Kind of, yeah, Yara said. I opened the flap. She was sort of at the main console, but she wasn't working. She was sitting still, which was unusual for her, with a mug of something hot that had probably been hot an hour ago, and she had the look of someone who had already been told a thing they were waiting to be told. Hendricks talked to you, I said. Not yet. He will. I know. I leaned against the tent pole. Outside, the desert was doing its nighttime thing. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees from the afternoon high, which sounded like relief and felt like punishment, and there's a wind coming in from the northwest that carried grit and the smell of nothing organic for miles. Delane's going to have a problem with it, I said. Delane has a problem with me on days when nothing's happening, she said. I've stopped tracking it. She took a sip of the cold coffee, made no face about it being cold. You ready for the patrol? I said. The question was genuine. Plus, the northern approach in the sector had comms dead zones that the cache operation had confirmed were being used deliberately. Signal jamming, low-grade, portable, the kind of equipment that a determined and resourceful group could move and set up in under an hour. Running comms support on that route, with a 4-star general 3 feet away, in terrain that actively resisted radio signal, was not a routine task. She looked at me for a moment. That middle register. I've been sort of listening to this sector for 7 months, she said. It wasn't arrogance, and it was something closer to the way a surgeon might say I've done this procedure, a statement of accumulated fact, not a boast. Yeah, I said, which okay. I left. The generator hummed behind me. Though to be fair, wind brought more grit. Hendricks, I guess, came to her at 22:30. She was already packed. General Hargrove's helicopter was a dark shape against the sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was night or morning. It came in low and direct, the rotor wash pushing the dust into spirals that looked briefly like living things before collapsing. We were lined up in two loose rows near the landing pad. Not quite parade ground, not quite casual. The specific posture of people trying to look simultaneously at ease and respectful, which meant everyone looked slightly like they'd forgotten what to do with their arms. Hargrove stepped off the helicopter, and he was smaller than I expected. Generals often are. There's a picture you build in your head from the rank and the name, and then a man steps into it and doesn't fill all the corners. He was in his mid-60s, compact, with the kind of face that had spent decades in sun, wind, and arrived at something that wasn't quite weathered and wasn't quite distinguished, but was exactly itself. He had 2 aides and a sergeant major named Flores who had the eyes of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and intended to survive 30 more. Hendricks met them at the pad edge. Introductions. Hargrove shook, hands with a directness that wasn't warmth or its opposite, just contact, deliberate, a thing being acknowledged. His eyes moved, I think, across the assembled soldiers the way you skin a map. Not inspecting exactly which reading. I watched his gaze pass over Delane, over Torres, over me, and pause just fractionally on Yara, who was standing at the edge of the formation with her comms rig mounted and a handset clipped to her shoulder strap, her face doing exactly what it always did, which was exist at its own temperature. Then Hargrove looked away and the patrol brief began. The patrol moved out at 0710. 12 of us, plus the general and his 2 aides. Delane was senior NCO on the ground. He moved with the energy of a man who had rehearsed this walk in his sleep. The first 3 kilometers were clean. Plus, terrain was rough, but familiar loose stone, hard pan, occasional scrub that looked dead, and probably was. The sun was already earning its keep. Yara walked forth from the front, which put her close to the general without being assigned to him basically. She had basically her hand set live and her head on a swivel, and about every 400 meters. She would adjust frequency settings in a small, practiced movement that nobody around her seemed to notice. I noticed. I started paying attention to her the way Brennan had described, the way you tune to something once you know the frequency exists. At kilometer 4, we hit the first dead zone. I knew it before the handset confirmed it. The silence on the radio channel had a specific quality that was different from quiet, the way a room sounds different when there's someone else in it you can't see. Then, Yara's handset gave a burst of static, and she pulled it from her shoulder. She was already adjusting before the patrol leader in front of her knew there was a problem. "Going to alternate," she said quietly into the handset. "Shifting to secondary, standby." 14 seconds. I counted. The channel opened, clean and clear on the secondary frequency, and she had already coordinated with the relay position she'd pushed through in. The briefing, the ones Delane had visibly dismissed, and the patrol's communications were intact, continuous, as if nothing had interrupted them. Delane, 3 positions ahead of me, glanced back once. He didn't say anything. General Hargrove, walking beside Hendricks 2 positions ahead of Yara, had his head inclined slightly, listening. Flores, the sergeant major, had stopped pretending to look at the terrain. Kilometer 6 was where it happened. Not a contact. Plus, not what you're imagining. No firefight, no ambush. This isn't that kind of story, and the truth is that most of what happens in a combat zone is slower and quieter and more grinding than the version people want to hear. What happened at kilometer 6 was that Yara stopped. She stopped and held up 2 fingers, and the patrol halted on muscle memory, and her handset was already live. She was talking low and precise. "Command, Kestrel 3, I'm reading partial signal, Grid Sierra 47, possible transmitting source, request confirmation." Hargrove had stopped too. He was watching her, and command came back in 20 seconds. Looked confused. The grid she'd identified didn't have any flagged activity. "I know," she said. "I'm saying I guess it does now." There was a pause on the command frequency. Then, "Can you, specify the signal type?" "Not yet. Give me 3 minutes." She sat down right there on the ground, in the middle of the patrol halt, with her equipment in her lap, and her eyes closed, which I'd never seen her do before. closed while her fingers moved over the equipment in that conversation she had with machines, the one the rest of US couldn't hear. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. For what it's worth, she opened her eyes. It's the same jamming profile as the cache site. Mobile unit, which currently stationary, approximately 400 meters bearing 220. Hargrove looked at Hendricks. Hendricks said, into his own radio, "Command, Kestrel Actual. Requesting QRF to grid." "Already sent the grid," Yara said quietly. The QRF was already moving. "We held the halt for 18 minutes while the Quick Reaction Force ran down the bearing," she'd identified. I TBH stood in the shade of nothing particular and drank warm water from my Camelback. Watched Yara repack her equipment with the economy of motion that was so specifically hers. Delane was standing near the front of the patrol, his back mostly to us, his sunflower seeds presumably somewhere on his person, but not in evidence. To be fair, Torres was quiet. He had the look of a 19-year-old who's recalculating something and doesn't have enough variables yet. The QRF found a portable jamming unit, abandoned, still warm from use. Someone had heard us coming and moved, but not before Yara had heard them. Flores, the sergeant major, walked over to where Yara was standing and said something I couldn't hear. She nodded once. He nodded back and walked away with the expression of a man who has just confirmed a thing he already believed. I thought about Brennan again. She can, in my opinion, hear a radio malfunction before the equipment knows it's malfunctioning. Not magic. Plus, just attention. The discipline of paying attention for 7 months in a place where most people were paying attention to other things. The patrol resumed. On the walk back, I fell in beside Nesbitt, who had his thermometer out. 113, he said. She called to be fair. Yesterday, I said. Plus 114. 113. Still. He looked at the thermometer, then ahead at Yara's back, moving at her pace, her pack sitting on her spine the way she'd packed it to sit. "You think Delane's look going to say anything?" he said. What would he say? Nesbitt thought about that. The desert wind came through with its grit, and it's nothing. Nothing, he said. Right. We walked. Plus, we got back to FOB Kestrel at 11:40. The sun was at its aggressive midpoint, the kind of high noon posture that feels personal, and the base had the flattened, heat-stun quality it got between 1100 and 1400 when even the generators seemed to be running at a lower level of enthusiasm. I guess the dust was everywhere. It was always everywhere. I'd stopped noticing it the way you stop, noticing a sound that never stops. Hargrove's aides moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had been transitioning generals between controlled environments for years. There, for what it's worth, was a briefing room waiting, water waiting, a series of scheduled conversations with Hendricks and the other senior officers waiting. The machinery of a general's visit was already in motion, independent of anything that had happened in the field. I watched Yara come through the gate. She went honestly straight to the comm tent, which was what she always did. Not to report, not to debrief. Plus, she went to check her equipment, run her post-patrol diagnostics, log the signal data she'd pulled from the field. That was the routine, and she maintained it with the same consistency she maintained everything. Delane went to the motor pool, where he stood for a while talking to nobody about nothing in particular, and then he went to his quarters. I want to clean my rifle again, which was already clean, because cleaning your rifle is one of those things you do when your hands need to be busy and your brain needs to be quiet. The afternoon briefing was at 1400. All senior NCOs, Hendricks, the aides, and Hargrove in the plywood room with the pull-down map and the 3 folding tables. I wasn't senior enough to be there. Neither was Torres. Neither, was Yara, technically, except that at 13:55, one of Hargrove's aides came to the comm tent and said the general had requested Sergeant Osei's presence. I know this because I was walking past the comm tent when the aide arrived, and I heard it through the canvas. I stopped and pretended to check something on my sleeve. There was a pause inside the tent, which then Yara said, yes, specialist. No inflexión. I heard her pretty much pack up what she was working on and leave through the other entrance. I got the briefing room account from Nesbitt, who had been there carrying a radio that nobody used, which was a standard method by which junior soldiers witnessed important events they had no business witnessing. What happened was this. Hargrove had the patrol debriefed in sequence. Hendricks first, then the senior NCOs. Standard procedure. Delane gave his account of the patrol, which was accurate in all the factual respects and managed through emphasis and omission to be a story primarily about patrol leadership and terrain management rather than about signal intelligence and early detection. He was good at it. I want to be clear about that. Delane was not stupid, and he was not incompetent, and the version of events he presented was not false. It just had a particular center of gravity. Hargrove listened. He had the quality of someone who had been listening to people talk for so long he no longer heard the words as words. He heard the space around them, the shape of what wasn't being said. Then he asked for Yara. She came in and stood at the end of the table, and Hargrove looked at her the way he'd looked at everyone, direct, without performance, and said, "Walk me through the signal you identified at kilometer 6. Start with when you first noticed it." She did. What Nesbitt described, trying to capture for me afterward while squinting at his thermometer and searching for the right words, was that she spoke about signals the way some people speak about music, not technically exactly, but with a kind of intimacy, a sense of long acquaintance. She described the profile of the jamming signal, its frequency signature, the way it differentiated from the background static of our own equipment. I think the specific quality that had told her it was mobile and recently placed rather than a fixed installation. She said she'd heard that profile before, Nesbitt told me, from like the cache site, and she said when you hear a thing once, you know it when it comes back. Hargrove had been quiet through all of it. His aides were taking notes. Flores was doing the thing with his eyes. Then Hargrove said, "How long have you been running signals analysis?" And Yara said, "I've been running communications, sir. I'm basically not a signals analyst." "No," Hargrove said, "but you're doing signals analysis. What you described is not communications work. What you described is pattern recognition on degraded signal under field conditions, without automated support, in real time." A pause. "I just listen like, sir, Staff Sergeant Osei." Hargrove leaned forward slightly. "I've signals intelligence units with 6 figures of equipment who would have missed what you caught this morning." Nesbitt said the room was quiet enough to hear the generator. Yara said, "The equipment can't hear the quiet parts, sir. You have to know the difference between equipment noise and signal noise, and that takes time. I've been here, I guess, 7 months." "I know," Hargrove said. "I read your file this morning. The thing is, I've thought about that a lot. I read your file this morning." He'd known who she was before he got off the helicopter. He'd looked at her in the formation lineup, and already known, which is why his gaze had paused. He'd come to FOB Kestrel with a general schedule and a general's agenda, and somewhere in the preparation for this visit, someone had flagged a staff sergeant at a small forward operating base in a sector most people back home couldn't find on a map, and Hargrove had read what was there to read. What was there to read? The cache operation. The signal intercept at 0215, and the 11 personnel recovered without casualties. 3 lines in a report that had moved up the chain in a way that most field reports didn't, because somewhere along the way someone had looked at those 3 lines and understood what they actually represented. Yara hadn't written a report, and she'd done her job and gone back to diagnostics. Someone else had written the report. I found out later it was Hendricks, who had a habit of giving credit specifically and accurately, which is rarer than it sounds, and who had sent a communication upward that described in plain language what had happened and who had made it happen. Like Hargrove had read it. The briefing ended at 15:30. Hargrove was scheduled to leave at 1600. The helicopter, the aides, the machinery moving to its next stop. There is a brief walkabout, which generals do at the end of visits as a combination of inspection and gesture, moving through the base with Hendricks and Flores, acknowledging the base's existence with their physical presence. I was near the maintenance bay when they came through. Yara was at the bench, and she had, as far as I could tell, returned from the briefing room, changed back in her work clothes, and resumed the diagnostic work she'd been doing before the aide came to get her. The 240B was back on the tarp, which her tools were in their row. Hargrove's walkabout brought him past the maintenance bay. He stopped. He stood in the doorway of the bay for a moment, looking at her work, and Yara looked up and said, "Sir," and started to rise, and Hargrove said, "At ease." Then he walked into the bay and looked at the weapon on the tarp, the organization of it, the deliberateness of the layout, and said, "What's this, Sue?" "Feed tray," she said. "The pawl's worn. I want to replace the whole assembly, not just the pawl." "You have the part?" "Had to order it." Using the downtime to look at the gas regulator. "It's at the far end of spec." Hargrove nodded. He looked at the regulator she'd indicated, which was sitting precisely at the position in her tool row that corresponded to its examination order. Then he looked at her, and what happened next is the part that I replay. The part that TBH, the story, is built around, though when I tell it I always feel like I'm describing it wrong, because the mechanics of it are simple and the weight of it's not. General Richard Hargrove, 4-star theater commander, took one step back from the workbench. He came to attention, which he raised his right hand to the brim of his cover. He saluted Staff Sergeant Yara Osei. She was still for a moment, half a beat that stretched. Then, actually, she came to attention and returned it crisp and correct and held at the regulation count before dropping it. Like Hargrove dropped his. He said, "Your sector is lucky to have you, Staff Sergeant." She said, "Thank you, sir." He left. Flores followed, with those 30-year eyes carrying some additional information now. The aides followed Flores, and I was standing 15 feet away, holding nothing, having apparently forgotten what I was doing before this happened. Delane was 20 feet in the other direction. He had been walking past when Hargrove stopped. He had stayed, the way you stay when something is happening that you need to see all the way through. He was still there. He was looking at the place where Hargrove had been standing. I don't know what was in his face, because I didn't look at his face. I looked at Yara. She had TBH already turned back to the bench. She picked up her torque driver and returned to the gas regulator. Her hands were steady. Her tools were in their row. The generator hummed. Plus, we stood at the edge of the landing pad and watched it go, and I thought about how a person could arrive and depart from a place and leave it fundamentally changed without breaking a single thing. The pad was just concrete and painted markings. The rotor wash settled. The dust spirals rose and fell. The generator hummed from its usual direction, which everything looked the same. Nothing was the same. Torres found, me at the chow hall that evening. He was carrying a tray with the mechanical diligence of someone whose body is performing routine tasks, while his head is somewhere else entirely. He sat across from me without asking, which was not his usual behavior. Torres typically traveled in Delane's orbit and would have needed a reason to separate from it. He ate for a while in silence, which then, he said, "You knew, didn't you, that she was," he searched for the word, "good," which that she was good. I thought about what to say. The honest answer was complicated. I'd known she was capable before the cache site. I'd known she was exceptional after it. I'd said something about it once. Good work, and said nothing the 6 or 7 times before that when it would have mattered more. Yeah, I said. Delane sort of been telling us he stopped. I know what he was telling you. She's been here 7 months, Torres said. And he put his fork down. I never asked her anything about her work, what she was doing. Plus, never once. He was 19. I want Luke to hold on to that. He was 19, and he was doing the thing that 19-year-olds sometimes do, which is sit with a new understanding of themselves that doesn't feel good and stay there anyway, instead of rationalizing their way out of it. "You can start now," I said. He picked his fork back up. 8. The chow hall, in my opinion. Noise moved around us. Metal on metal, low conversations, someone's boots squeaking on the floor. "Does she?" he started. "Just go talk to her," I said. He nodded. He didn't go that night, but he went. He went 2 days later, and he came back and told me she'd been showing him how to read signal degradation patterns on the Bitcher, and that she'd apparently been willing to show anyone this for months, but nobody had asked. Nobody had asked. Delane was harder to account for, because Delane was a harder kind of person, the kind whose convictions are structural, load-bearing, part of the architecture that holds their identity upright. You can't remove a load-bearing wall without consequences. You can't tell a man like Delane that 7 months of small dismissals amounted to something without asking him to hold a weight that might buckle him. I don't know what happened inside Delane. I never will, and what I know is the outside. What I observed over the following 2 weeks. He didn't apologize to Yara, and some part of me had half expected it, which was naive. Men like Delane don't apologize the way architects don't demolish their own buildings. It's not that they can't see the problem, it's that the problem and the structure are the same thing. But he stopped. The seed stopped landing near her. The asides to Torres stopped, which in briefings when Yara spoke, Delane developed the habit of looking at the map rather than at the table, which was his version of listening, and the table was his version of dismissing, and I know the difference because I've been watching him for weeks. He stopped volunteering assessments of her work to people who hadn't asked. It was, in my opinion, not enough. I want to say that clearly. 7 months of accumulated noise does not go quiet because a general came and went. The math doesn't work that way. What was said was said. What was for what it's worth, not challenged was not challenged, and the not challenging has a weight of its own that belongs to more than Delane. It was not enough, but it was a stop, and a stop is where most things begin that eventually become something better. I talked to Yara once, more before I rotated out. It was late. I was, on my last week, and my brain had taken on the quality it always gets in final weeks. Half here, half somewhere ahead of itself, which makes you useless in the present and not yet useful in the future. I was at the perimeter doing a check I didn't need to do because I needed the walk, and the light was on in the comm tent because of course it was. I knocked. Yeah, she said. I opened the flap. She was at the console, which was usual, but she wasn't working. She had the handset in her lap, and her head tilted slightly, the listening posture, and I realized she was just listening to the frequency, to whatever was in the static that the rest of US couldn't hear. Anything, I said. Not tonight. I stayed in the doorway. The desert outside was doing its cold nighttime thing, 40 degrees below the afternoon's peak, and the wind had dropped to something that was almost nothing, just enough movement to tell you air existed. I'm rotating out Friday, I said. I know. I stopped because there isn't a clean sentence for what I wanted to say. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner, felt too small and too large at the same time. You deserve better from all of us was true, but Yara Ose didn't strike me as a woman waiting for her due to be verbally acknowledged by a specialist from Corpus Christi. She looked at me in that middle register. Reyes, she said, whatever you're about to say, I've been doing this since before Kestrel, and I'll be doing it after. A pause. What are doing right now, she said. This basically conversation, which the thing you actually did, and she meant the 2 days before she'd found the cash, the small recognition, the good work that was inadequate, but was something that's the thing that matters. Not the general, not the salute. The general coming and going doesn't change what it was before he got here. I thought about that. She turned back to the console and picked up the handset. Went back to listening. Get some sleep, Reyes, she said. Plus, you look like someone who hasn't slept in 4 months. More like 5, I said. More like 5, she agreed, and the corner of her mouth did something small that on someone else would have been a smile. I left FOB Kestrel on a Friday morning. The helicopter out was smaller than Hargrove's, a logistics bird, smelling of jet fuel, and the particular institutional staleness of aircraft that move people and supplies with democratic indifference. I was the only soldier rotating out that morning. The rest of the manifest was mail and repair parts. I could see the comm tent from the pad. The light, honestly, was already on. I thought about what she'd said. Not the general, not the salute. The salute would travel. I knew that even then. Bases are, small worlds with high information density, and something like a 4-star saluting a staff sergeant would move through the population like weather, would become a story. People told would eventually reach other forward operating bases, and Other comms tents where other women were doing work that the people around them hadn't learned to see yet. The salute mattered, but she was right about what came before it. The salute was a moment. One moment clean and official, witnessed and remembered. What came before was 7 months of ordinary days in which the ordinary math of who gets believed and who gets dismissed have been running its ordinary course, and the only interruptions to that math had been small things. A knock on, I think, a tent flap, a good work that wasn't enough, but was said as specialist who started paying attention because a medic named Brennan in Ohio had mentioned, almost as an aside, that she could hear things the equipment couldn't. Small things. I don't know if I handled any of it right. I know I handled some of it wrong. I know there were 6 or 7 moments where silence was a choice I made, and the choice cost something I didn't pay, and she did. The helicopter lifted off. Kestrel dropped away below me. The generator housing, the comm tent, the maintenance bay with its green tarp, the landing pad with its paint already fading in the sun. Kind of small from above. The kind of small that a place only becomes when you're leaving it. I lost sight of the comm tent's light before I lost sight of the base. I've been out for 3 years now, and I work in systems integration in San Antonio, which is a career path that involves listening to what networks are and aren't telling you and identifying the gaps between what the signal says and what it means. My supervisor said, kind of in my first review, that I had an unusual instinct for pattern recognition under noisy conditions. I didn't tell her where I learned it. I think about Kestrel sometimes. Plus, the generator. The 40-degree temperature swings. The dust that got into everything, your food, and your rifle, and the back of your throat. To be fair, think about Yara Ose at 0215, alone in a tent, listening to static that everyone else had dismissed, staying with it for 40 minutes because she knew the difference between noise and signal because 7 months in that sector had taught her the shape of the absence of things. I think you know about Hardrow Salute and the weight of what it acknowledged, not just her competence, but the discipline of attention, the rigor of showing up and doing the work and knowing it will be underestimated and doing it anyway, every day in a place where the temperature at noon makes you feel like the world is trying to burn you out of it. And I think about what she said. Pretty much the thing that matters, not the general. Plus, not the salute. She was right. She's right about most things, which I assume she's still demonstrating to whoever is currently sharing a forward operating base with her at whatever latitude, in whatever heat. The salute was one moment. 7 months of paying attention, of showing up, of doing the work in the dark while the generator hummed, and the dust came in, and nobody was watching. That was the whole story. The general just read what was already written.